welcome to the Festival of Ideas here at the University of York, and to today's talk, which is all going to be about Neanderthals. So I'm Penny Spikins. I'm a professor in the Department of Archaeology here. I'm going to start with just a few technical notes that you need to know today. Then I'm going to introduce our speaker, and she'll tell you all about her work. So, if you're watching live, you can ask questions using the Q&A button on your screen. That's the button down at the bottom of the screen if you scroll along. This is available throughout the event, so you can ask questions at any time, and then we'll look through those questions at the end and ask those to Becky. Should you have technical issues, such as loss of Wi-Fi, you can rejoin the event using the original link. Please also remember that today's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch this again on our YouTube channel. Subtitles are available in this event. To turn these on or off, use the CC Live Transcript button at the bottom of your screen. So I'd like to get straight on to introducing you today to Rebecca Wragg Sykes. Dr. Wragg Sykes is an archaeologist, writer, and creative professional, honorary fellow in the School of Archaeology, Classics and Egyptology at the University of Liverpool and at the University de Bordeaux. Her first book, Kindred, Neanderthal, Life, Love, Death and Art, is a critically acclaimed bestseller, and I think we're going to be hearing a little bit more about it. A little bit of a background to this talk. Neanderthals, since their discovery more than 160 years ago, Neanderthals have metamorphosed from the losers of the human family to A-list hominins. And archaeologist Rebecca Wragg Sykes uses her experience at the cutting edge of Palaeolithic research to share new understanding of Neanderthals, shoving aside clichés of rag-clad brutes in an icy wasteland. Rebecca, author of Kindred, reveals them to be curious, clever connoisseurs of their world, technologically inventive and ecologically adaptable. Above all, they were successful survivors for more than 300,000 years during times of massive climatic upheaval, maybe things they could tell us about. Much of what defined us was also in Neanderthals, and their DNA is still inside us. Planning, cooperation, altruism, craftsmanship, aesthetic sense, imagination, perhaps even a desire for transcendence beyond mortality. So I'd like you now to join Rebecca as she reveals a deeper and more nuanced story of where humanity itself is our ancient shared inheritance. Over to you, Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. It's a wonderful privilege to speak at the festival, and yeah, looking forward to the questions at the end. So let me just sort out my talk and get ready to share my screen. Yes, so this talk today is a very brief run through of some of the themes from the book. It's quite a large book, and there's far too much to go into in detail today. So it's going to be a guide to some of the things that I found, I guess, most fascinating about Neanderthals, and the things that I wanted to draw out in terms of how we think about them as well. So I'll just move there. Okay, so let's start at the start. So the rendezvous, the first moment where we realized that there was something that had been akin to humans, another form of human that had been on the planet with us. Essentially, this is in the middle of the 19th century. 1856 is the date when the first recognized Neanderthal skull was actually found. And this is from the Neanderthal, so the Neander Valley. In Germany, there's a cave, the Feldhofer Cave. And the picture on the right there shows the skull cap that was found by miners during industrial works in a massive limestone gorge. There were also some other bones found. And this was the point at which, really tying into lots of other things that were going on at the time, with understanding in geology, a better appreciation for the age of the earth, and a huge amount of interest in fossil animals and what this meant, and what things coming out of caves all over Europe and elsewhere actually were. And this was really a chance discovery. The quarry manager happened to notice some of the material that was being blasted out from this cave and saw that it didn't really look like an animal, and then passed that on to the local person who ran the Natural History Society, and then it kind of went up the intellectual food chain, arriving with anatomists in Bonn. And from that point, it kind of spread out and the world began to take notice. But that was not the first Neanderthal discovery. My slides are not going forward. There we are. In fact, there had been earlier Neanderthal discoveries that we know of. There were two. And this is kind of an interesting idea to think about the fact that we already had found some Neanderthals before 1856, but we didn't recognize them. They were sort of invisible to us. So on the left there, you can see an image of the top of a little skull, and this was found in 1836 in Belgium. It's actually somebody who was intentionally going and excavating fossils from sites, but it wasn't recognized as something out of the ordinary until the early 20th century, actually. So this one was sort of not really a recognized form. Then just over a decade later, in 1848, the skull in the center there was presented to the Scientific Society, which was the Army's Scientific Society on Gibraltar, which was British territory. This one was another find from a quarry, and we don't actually know who found this or the original circumstances. We just know it became part of the Society's collections, and there is an entry for it in their minutes. And it was presented by the secretary, who is rather wonderfully named Lieutenant Edmund Flint. But this also was not recognized as anything odd, even though that face is really quite striking, very large orbits in the skull, massive nasal aperture there. But you can see it's actually covered in sort of concretions, and that might have been part of the reason why it wasn't really recognized. And it wasn't until a doctor who happened to be familiar with ethnographic research and obviously anatomy, and also knew people who had been working on the German find in 1863. So this is a few years after the German find. He happened to be visiting Gibraltar and was shown the collections and noticed this skull and thought, oh, this is something, I'm going to send it over to England. It was shipped over in 1864 and viewed by Darwin, amongst others, and was recognized as the second Neanderthal that they knew about. And immediately they realized that this meant that there had been a widespread population between Germany and all the way down in the southern Mediterranean. So it's really important. But there's also another aspect to this idea of invisible Neanderthals and what we're ready to see and what we're not ready to see, which is on the right there. You can see this is actually a drawing of a stone artifact, a hand axe, and this is from the 1600s. This is the first recorded example of a Palaeolithic, so an older Stone Age tool that was discovered. This was found in London. That was understood at the time to be maybe a weapon of a Celt that an invading Roman army had been attacking, because it was found near the bones of an elephant. Of course, that's actually not the correct interpretation. We know that now, but they didn't have that possibility in their minds then, because it was well before any of the understanding about the true age of the earth, things like this. And it wasn't actually until the 1880s that Neanderthal skeletal remains were found alongside stone tools. Before that, we had the bones, and then there were other sites where people were excavating the artifacts, but there were no bones there. So this sort of the moment at which Neanderthals actually had a culture, we recognize that, was significantly later. So the story of how we encountered them and how we understood what they meant is actually really quite drawn out. But fast forward, there's a lot of history of science in the book, and I could do an entire talk about that, but we will fast forward today to where we are now. So who were the Neanderthals? What are we actually even talking about with Neanderthals? Essentially, I think the consensus view of most archaeologists today is that Neanderthals are another form of ancient human that was around on the earth. You know, we have a deep, quite rich family of other hominins, relations of ours, but Neanderthals really are very close to us evolutionarily, and we'll see that in the next slide. But this is an image from the book, and it just shows you actually if anybody still has preconceptions about Neanderthals as being some sort of halfway point between an ape and us, it really is not the case. You know, you look at the body there, this Neanderthal is on the right, and you can see they are completely upright, they are fully bipedal, they walk on two legs, and at first glance that's clearly a human body plan. However, there are differences, some more significant than others. Most Neanderthals are a bit shorter, but if you look closely, you can see that there are other differences that would have had a clear visual impact if you saw, you know, a Neanderthal right in front of you. So the Neanderthal's rib cage, you can see there, is much more flaring out at the bottom, which means that they wouldn't have had such little tucked in waists as we have. The shape of the pelvis is a bit different. And also over their whole body, the bones themselves are actually thicker as well. But if you go up to the face, you know, the face is what you would encounter if you meet a Neanderthal, and that would really be quite striking. A big face, as we said before when we saw the Gibraltar skull, very large eyes, large hole for the nose, and also the shape of the face is different. Us in our broader sort of context of human origins, we are quite weird. We have quite flat little faces that are tucked right under our foreheads, and really big globular skulls. Neanderthals didn't look like that. They had foreheads that were more swept back. The skull is kind of like more aerodynamic front to back. And also the front of their faces is pulled forward more. They have more bone forming cells in the front, whereas we have bone absorbing ones. So there are real differences. So who are the Neanderthals? Well, we've looked at their bodies. We've discussed how they are similar to us, how they're not, and the fact that the reason that they are quite similar is because they are very close to us in an evolutionary context. And you can see here, this slide is showing basically 4 million years worth of human evolution. At the bottom, sort of the lower half is about 3 million years, and then the time scale changes. So the red circle there is showing the point at which we share a common ancestor with Neanderthals, and it's actually very recent indeed. It's only somewhere between about 550 to 750,000 years ago. And in the broader span of human evolution, that's super recent. So actually we should expect Neanderthals physically to be far more like us than many of those earlier species you can see at the bottom, which are Australopithecine species. They're much more primitive looking in many ways. And I think one of the other things that's really important for people to understand in how we think about Neanderthals today is not only their closeness to us in physical terms, but another idea, a preconception that has, I guess, been very persistent, and it's linked with the history of their discovery, and the fact that they were often found in caves and deposits with creatures from colder climates that are no longer in most of Europe, like reindeer and extinct species such as mammoth, woolly rhino. This notion that Neanderthals are primarily or fundamentally creatures of the cold, so very Arctic adapted, all of this. They did live during cold periods, absolutely for sure, but they're not like Arctic foxes or muskox, which is this creature up here. They are true specialists of deep, deep cold, periglacial tundra environments. Neanderthals actually don't seem to really like that kind of extreme cold. And it's partly, we can see here, this is a slide showing the sort of 400,000 years of time, and the red boxes, I've just made it easy for you, are the periods during which Neanderthals were around when it was actually warm. And we can see number 5 there, with the zoom out, that's a period which was about 122,000 years ago, when it was even warmer than it is now, by 1 or 2 degrees. So you must think of Neanderthals as being honed physically and in an adaptive sense during cold periods, but they were equally animals, or organisms rather, that were living in forests, living in warm summers, as we're having today, and even warmer. So the idea really is that Neanderthals were really flexible. They were able to adapt over the very long term, over 350,000 years that they were around, to these huge climate cycles that the Earth was experiencing, and other animals were too. And this means that the worlds that they lived in were very variable indeed. They did live alongside reindeer and woolly rhinos, but they also lived alongside forest rhinoceros, macaques, hippopotamus during the warm period. So this idea of diversity is really important. And alongside that, not only do we have this massive chronology and the climate change, but they lived across a really huge geographical area as well. So I'm in Wales right now. There are Neanderthal sites here. This is like the far west of their territory, or of their entire range. They're right across into Europe, into the Mediterranean, the Near East, into Central Asia, and over in Siberia as well. So they are really Eurasian. They're a Western Eurasian hominin. And another thing I think that I wanted to really communicate in writing the book was to bring together all of not only the stuff we know about Neanderthals, but actually the fascinating reality of archaeology and how modern 21st century archaeology works, and what we can get out of the remains of Neanderthal sites and the stuff we can find out about their lives through the amazing ingenuity of what we do as a discipline today. And for example, just comparing what goes on in an archaeological site today with what was going on, in the late 19th century. If you had a cave and it's full of stuff, well, blasted out with dynamite, it'd be done in 2 weeks. That's not what we do today. Today we are absolutely aware of basically the value of almost every tiny scrap of stuff we find in a site, and that means that everything is recorded, sampled. We can laser scan sites. There are some excavations, there's a picture on the screen here, where they have barcoding systems for their artifacts. They scan them all, stick them into databases, analyze it, and then they can project that out again and create 3D representation of the the layers, the micro layers within a site. So this is really what modern archaeology is. And the reason to do all of that is because it allows us to see and know things about Neanderthal lives that would just have been beyond the dreams of any of the earliest prehistorians. So for example, by collecting all of the little bits of stone rather than just the pretty tools that have been retouched, we can actually, as you can see here on the left, the lower left, we can fit back together like a jigsaw, what we call refitting, an entire sequence where a single Neanderthal, this comes from an Italian site, Grotto Formani, about 55,000 years old. A single Neanderthal sat down and took apart a block of stone completely systematically, choosing the different methods of striking, the different techniques, and actually changing that through the whole sequence. So we can see the decision making from individual Neanderthals because we've kept all that material. And similarly on the right there, you can see that we have material from micro studies of the sediments inside hearths. And this allows us to do things like basically show that individual hearths had been burned in different phases at different temperatures. Then the ash was cleared out, dumped somewhere else in the cave. And all of that says a huge amount about the sophistication of Neanderthal life, their home life in their sites. So this is why understanding how much archaeology itself has changed is really vital to telling the story of what we know about Neanderthals today. So as I said, that the whole book covers anything you might want to know about Neanderthals, I hope. For example, what they ate. I can't go into all of that today, but one of the key take-home points is that Neanderthals were really picky about their food in some circumstances, in that they would target animals that were higher value, they have more fat, they're adult animals. But they weren't just carnivores, okay? This is one of the real changes in our understanding, they also did eat plant food. And that seems to vary according, as we were seeing earlier, to the different kinds of climates and environments that they were actually living in. So they were really adaptable. And again, I could talk for a whole hour about just the technology of Neanderthals, and all the amazing sort of different perspectives that we now have on their ability as stone workers. I'm not going to do that in this talk, because we have other things to get onto, but I do just want to say this image and the previous one are from the book, and they are the work of the wonderful Alison Atkin, who is an artist, but she's also trained as an archaeologist, so it's fantastic to work with her. And I wanted this scene to really communicate or sort of do away with the idea that Neanderthals were any kind of sort of random stone bashing crowd. You know, we can see from all these techniques that I've mentioned, refitting, that they were in some of their different technologies, because they had many different kinds of stone technologies, it was almost like production line efficiency. You know, they were not wasteful. They knew exactly what they were after in terms of the products. This is the thing that I really think is fascinating about Neanderthals, and that has, I guess, really that emerged for me in writing the book and having to take a really huge scale sort of perspective and look at basically everything that Neanderthals do. And one thing that is really striking for me is that they have a really clear engagement with materials. You know, I was saying before about the way that they hunted animals. They are well aware of the differences in between different species. Sometimes they're very picky, and we see the same thing in how they use in how they use materials. So stone, aside from the different technologies, which are all, you know, systematic and very ordered, the types of stone as well. For just a basic fundamental example that sort of underlies all the rest is that they knew very much, they didn't have a geological knowledge, but they understood the material properties of different kinds of rock. And you basically do not see Neanderthals moving rubbishy stone away from a region where it occurs. They only move around the good stuff, but that changes according to their mobility patterns and things like this. So you can see a real sort of organization in their choice. But what they do with materials is also very flexible. So in some regions, primarily the Mediterranean, and the Greek and the Italian peninsulas, we see that they experiment with shell. On the right there, that is a shell tool, and they apply the same kind of know-how that they make particular sorts of stone tools to shell. So there is a flexibility there. Another kind of material that didn't used to be regarded as very Neanderthalish was bone. And certainly they didn't do as much with bone as later early Homo sapiens populations did. But we have a better understanding now that they did know about the properties of bone as a useful tool, and they used it when it suited them. So at the bottom there with the black background, you can see that there are multiple small tools. These are actually the tips of bone tools. And these have only been quite recently discovered. They are probably skin working tools. And we can tell Neanderthals are selecting not only the ribs, but also the ribs of larger animals, even in sites where, for the most part, it's mostly things like reindeer, quite small, but they're going for the ribs of bison. So they're choosing the kind of tools they want. And then if we go to the left, we're coming into the plant zone. I was talking about how they ate plants. They also used plants as a resource. And although it's unusual to have preservation of wooden or other plant objects compared to the amount of stone we have in sites, it does exist. The thing that looks like a cleaver there comes from a Spanish site with very unusual preservation with flowstone over the floors, and it creates these casts, a little bit like at Pompeii. And so that object is actually the filled in cast of the void that you can see below. Presumably that's some sort of just domestic tool that had been made of wood, completely unique, really interesting, but very familiar looking. And then just to the left of that, this is a find from a French site, Abri du Maras, which appears to be a twisted fibre, 3-ply twisted, which means that it's hard to understand without some more experiments exactly whether that's possible accidentally or not, but it doesn't seem to be. And that's been made from conifer, either conifer bark or possibly conifer root. Very fine though. So what that is potentially revealing in terms of plant fiber use is really difficult to assess, but it's really interesting, and it opens up a window onto the organic materials. Then we have at the top here, really striking, it's what it looks like is the tip of a spear, wooden spear. This is from a site 330,000 years old, Schöningen, a German site, where there are many spears, and they are not only striking in that they are clearly weapons, but there is real craftsmanship in the production of those objects, but also again the materials. So the tips of the spears, there's about 8 of them, are made from the base of tree trunks, which is the most robust wood. And then they're also slightly offset. They haven't carved it straight down the length, they've carved it in an offset way, which will prevent splitting on impact. So we can see that again, it's almost like, you know, carpentry in terms of the understanding of how wood behaves, and what you might want to do with it. So this is a sort of a run through of Neanderthals as consciously engaging with materials. And then this is other aspect to what Neanderthals are doing with the material world around them. And it ties into things that people have wondered about for a very long time. You know, did Neanderthals have any kind of symbolism or art? And really, those terms are so loaded that I don't like using them very much. And I think it's more instructive for us to come at it from a material perspective again and talk about aesthetics, and how Neanderthals are using materials to create effects or to change things. So we have at the top there, you have a lump of pigment, red pigment. And this is one area that's really expanded in what we think Neanderthals were into and interested in, which is natural colour. We have a much larger range of sites now than used to be believed, where we have black, reds, yellows, natural pigments. It's not everywhere, but there is certainly an interest that's repeated in different places. Sometimes it changes through time in a site, but similarly with how they treat other substances, we can see even that there is intentional selection sometimes for the purity of these minerals. So they're not just randomly picking stuff up. How are they using this colour? Well, if we go around in a clockwise direction, that's actually a piece of shell there, that has some red pigment on. But that's interesting, okay? It's a shell, possibly it's from food waste, it's uncertain. But what's very interesting is that the pigment mix on that site is a mix. It's a mix of 2 different sorts of pigment from different places in the landscape. And it also appeared to have some iron pyrite in, which is fool's gold. So potentially had like a sparkly sort of effect. Now, we don't know why that was mixed and why it's on the shell. It's also on the tip of a horse's bone from that site, and just a tiny trace of it. But the fact they're mixing to create presumably a new visual effect is really important. If we go down a bit below that, you can see there's another shell. This is actually a fossil shell. So this is where it gets more interesting, where we have pigment applied to a shell that, because it's a fossil, it's nothing to do with food waste. That fossil itself, this is an Italian site this time, Grotto Formani again, where that core came from. And that fossil shell had to have come from at least 100 kilometers away from where this shell was eventually excavated. And the red color you can see on that itself came from about 40 kilometers in another direction. So you have an unusual object that's been collected, a little fossil shell with red on the outside that's been applied. Again, understanding the motivation behind that is almost impossible. You know, why there's so many different permutations of why that might happen, who might have done it, how many people were involved, how long that was carried for. But the fact that you have these 2 different substances, and again, it's being applied to a surface, I think is important. If we go round again at the 6 o'clock position now, you can see this is another example of colour on an unusual object. So over the Neanderthal world, it seems in general they are a bit more interested in birds than was once understood, and sometimes that's to do with food. But in other cases, it seems that there is an interest in either the feathers or actually the skins of the wings in a few sites, but also the talons, the feet of birds. And this is the talon of a white-tailed eagle. This site is about 130,000 years old, Krapina in Croatia. And as it stands, it's interesting because there are about 8 of these talons from this site. We don't know the original context because it was excavated in the 1890s. So we don't know if all those talons were ever together or they were just sort of distributed around the site. But this one was very recently analysed and again found to have a pigment mix on it in a tiny little speck. And it's not a natural thing that's coming from the cave. That's another intentional recipe for a pigment. So that sort of movement through pigment and color and then mixing is really interesting as a way of thinking about aesthetics. And then we have these 2 other examples here. We're coming around sort of to the 9 o'clock position on the slide. And this is another way that Neanderthals were interested in altering surfaces. We have a hyena bone here, and then just above it is a representation of some engravings that are on the floor of another cave in Gibraltar, not where that skull was from, a different one. But those are linked by this idea of mark making, basically, on surfaces. They're at different scales, different materials, and they're quite rare as a category. We don't have many objects like this. There's another one with a raven bone from elsewhere. But what they share is an intention to create regularized series of markings. And it has been suggested that perhaps, at least for the lower one there, the bone, this potentially is some kind of notational system, that those markings have been not only created individually. This is nothing to do with butchering, by the way. Those are not sort of just incidental marks, but they were aimed to have an even spacing between them, which is, if this was found in a much later site, then it would be probably interpreted as a tally system, something like this. It's recording information or potentially quantity, something like that. But you put all that together and you come back to the top, and actually that lump of pigment at the top, I'm not sure you can see it with the quality of the slide, but there is also markings on this, and they are not as regularized, but they are nothing to do with scraping that pigment for powder. So there's all these links between different materials and what Neanderthals are doing that may be some kind of emergent aesthetic sense. So in terms of the aesthetics and this question of art, there have been some recent publications about some Spanish sites where we have what appear to be cave paintings, well, tons of them all through the caves actually, but dates on calcite either overlying or next to them have been published that are significantly older than any known Homo sapiens presence in that area, so sort of pre-50,000, pre-65,000. The reality of those sites, it's difficult to know. I'm not a specialist in dating, but other people who are have critiqued the precise dating done on those cases. So whether this sort of this linear feature on the left or what's actually a negative handprint, whether those are real or not, I'm not sure. But in a sense, does it really matter? You know, I mean, the picture on the bottom there on the bottom right, it's actually a handprint just in sand from a site where Neanderthals were living. So I don't think it's unreasonable to think that Neanderthals might have a sense of their own bodily markings. You know, handprints and footprints were around them. But also think about all the stuff we've just seen, the idea of making marks on surfaces, of altering surfaces with color. We know they're doing it on other substances. But it's the idea of forming a representational image, I think, that remains something that's not clear that Neanderthals did. And then we come to something that no one else was doing except Neanderthals for an awful long time. This is a totally unique, very odd site that again was a recent find. This is Bruniquel from France. And this is basically one of the weirdest things that we found Neanderthals up to. This is dated about 174,000 years old. It's in a cave very deep inside a hill, about 300 meters, in the dark in this chamber. And what's happened here is that Neanderthals have gone in, snapped loads and loads of stalagmites, stalactites, selected them by size, and then formed these ring structures. So the white picture down there is looking down on the site from above. And you can see there's these huge rings, one large one, one small one, and some piles in the middle. And the red and the orange around those are areas of burning. So this is not a living site as far as we can see. We don't know what they're doing, but the intentionality is obvious. And even more so, they haven't just sort of shoved things together. If you look at the lower right picture, you can see that there is actual construction going on here. There are things arranged together in lines. And then at the bottom, there's pieces actually stacked one on top of each other like this and balanced. So this really is this is some sort of built construction. Completely unique. We don't know what it is, but in terms of aesthetics and engagement with materials, again, really intriguing. The debate about what Neanderthals did with their dead is kind of another angle on how they thought and cognition and possible symbolic thought and things like this. There is so much more modern, recent, amazing material on this that, well, you'll have to read the book. But suffice it to say that there is some really interesting progress that's been made. In the early days, on the left there, you can see a skeleton lying on its side. That was excavated 1908 and assumed, many of these early discoveries were assumed to actually just maybe be burials. To prove that is, of course, the difficult thing. And modern researchers have gone back to some of the early sites and reassessed them. So I love the picture in the middle. This is La Chapelle au Son, a French cave. And the top image there is from the 1909 excavations with a big pit within which a Neanderthal was found. And then you can see there's like a picnic basket there on the lower right. The lower picture is where archaeologists very recently have gone back to reassess, re-excavate that site. You can see there's a box on the lower right, which is the case for their laser surveying system. So I like the juxtaposition of that. But essentially, we are now in a position with all of our whizzy modern methods to be able to go back and look at these sites that have long had contentious claims about them and really get down into the nitty-gritty of the sediments and say, well, was that really a pit or not? It's difficult with old sites. So on the right hand picture side of the slide, you can see what we also have now, which is some of the first new in situ, so still in the site, Neanderthal skeletons that are coming out and being excavated for decades. And this is from Shanidar, a very famous site in Iraq. And I think the information that's going to come from this site and other places where we have these ability to apply all our modern methods is going to be really, really important for sort of tying down exactly what level of interaction Neanderthals were having in terms of intentionally placing whole bodies into sites and whether they, cut little pits or graves or whether they use natural features and the different dimensions of that. But also, in fact, something else that has emerged from what we know that Neanderthals were up to now is that they were really interested in doing other stuff with the dead, and that includes taking them apart and butchering them. Sometimes there's some cannibalism for sure, but they also are using sometimes parts of the bodies as tools. You can use pieces of bone to actually work stone tools, and sometimes this is going on. So that's interesting. It might sound a bit outlandish, but actually it's not that far off what we see throughout later prehistory as well. This is actually a normal thing that happens in some circumstances. But again, we come back to this idea of aesthetics and changing surfaces and an interaction with materials. First of all, on the left there, you can see that there is a fragment from the top of a skull with some sort of little pitting on it. And this is a French site where essentially the top of this probably a butchered skull was used as one of these tools for working stone. And it's completely unique. It's actually a really bad choice if you want to work stone. It's the only piece of skull from any Neanderthal site of any species of animal. It's a Neanderthal that they've chosen. So this has actually been used despite its unsuitability. And I think that's significant. And on the right here, this is the same site as the talon there with the pigment was on, probably a different layer. There's also loads of processed Neanderthal bodies from this site in various sort of states of being smashed up. But one of them, this skull, has along the top a series of over 30 really tiny little cuts, but they're not butchery related. They're nothing to do with it being skinned or taking off meat. This is much more similar to that very regular intentional creation of markings, but they're so small. It's really difficult to be certain whether they were meant to be visible or meant to be touched, or it was maybe just the creation of them, that there was some meaning in that for whoever did it, whoever was watching or not. So I think bringing all this together, there are echoes between all the different things that Neanderthals are up to. What are the differences between us and Neanderthals? There are differences, you know, for all the stuff that I talk about in the book about how they're flexible, successful, adaptable, all of this, sophisticated. There are some differences in terms of the particularities of what they are doing compared to what contemporary early Homo sapiens populations and the ones who came after the Neanderthals disappeared were doing. So, for example, we don't see any carvings like this of a female figure. We don't see any images of animals. From contexts where there is no possibility of any mixing at all between Homo sapiens layers and Neanderthal layers, we don't ever see pendants and this kind of thing that Neanderthals are up to. And even though, as I showed, you know, they're making marks on surfaces, there's nothing as geometrically clear as these things. These objects here with the line scratched on, that's ostrich eggshell from South African sites. That's about 80,000 years old. And again, even if you have bodies being taken apart or deposited whole, we never find so far anything with Neanderthals where you have this hugely rich deposits of material objects along with those people. So these are real differences. So just to tie up, basically, bringing all these ideas together, and you know what I've tried to do in the book and explore all of this in far more detail. But one of the ways we can see how much our views of Neanderthals have changed is the way that we have literally represented them. And there's a feedback that goes on as well between our cultural expectations and our views about Neanderthals and the archaeology. The archaeology throws up new possibilities, we imagine them differently, and then we have different expectations of what we might find and what we might look for in archaeological sites. So here we can see some of the earliest images of Neanderthals. That sketch there is actually the first ever reconstruction from 1864, when that skull from Gibraltar arrived in England, and somebody drew sort of the skull and then imagined the rest of the body. It looks very chimpish, although they have a hafted tool, which is really interesting. The one in the middle is the Feldhofer skull, and then on the right, this is by the 1930s. You can see it's looking a lot more human-like, but really kind of just depressed, and not anything that's sort of an organism that looks well adapted, or that looks sort of, you know, comfortable in the environment. They just look ready to be extinct, basically. And this idea and these representations were quite persistent. But if we come to where we are today, it's so much richer, the view that we have of Neanderthals, and this is of course reflected by the wonderful artists who work today. So we have Mauricio Anton there on the left, a really nice image of a male Neanderthal, and it's incorporating these different things like a spear, shell, pigment. In the middle we have a female Neanderthal hunting. Again, she has a hafted spear, and again it's the pigment there. This is a sculpture by the Kennis brothers. And on the lower right there, one of my favorite artists working at the moment, Tom Björklund, was really happy to have some of his images in the book. This is really important. Neanderthals out in the landscape, just getting on with stuff, looking confident, and especially important, a male Neanderthal with a child. If you look at the whole corpus of reconstruction images of prehistoric people, especially, you know, Neanderthals, there's hardly any images of men, males interacting with children, much less in an affectionate way. So this view of Neanderthals as rounded organisms is really where we are. And I love this one by Tom Björklund. This is for an exhibition in the Moisgard Museum, because this really encapsulates how archaeology works with our imagining and what artists bring to this. This is a piece of birch tar, a synthetic substance that Neanderthals invented. And I love this because Neanderthals are just out in the environment in a birch forest doing their thing. Really beautiful image. And these are two sets of absolutely gorgeous sculptures, again by the Canis brothers. And these also, I think, really bring home that Neanderthals today, quite rightly, are allowed to look happy, look like life is not quite so bad, and be confident looking and affectionate with each other. And I just love that child's face on the left. It's challenging us, and I think this is what we should be doing. I think challenging our own ideas. This is an image of the genetics, and the red star is basically showing the points at which there were interbreeding events, that some of which, or one of which, led to the genetic material from Neanderthals, which is in living people. We only found out that there had been interbreeding between us and Neanderthals. We only found this out a decade ago. It's very recent, but I think it has had a real impact on how we feel about Neanderthals. Even archaeologists professionally, it was an amazing thing for all of us, but how people individually feel about Neanderthals has changed. And I get emails from people and they're saying, oh, I've got 2%, and they're proud in a different way. It's very interesting to me. And yeah, we need to reimagine what those relations in the past were like. What were the contexts for interbreeding? I don't think it's all about violence at all. I think something else is there in terms of curiosity, matches what we see about how Neanderthals think about their own world. And this is kind of where I want to leave you. The archaeology has changed how we think about Neanderthals. The genetics has been such a bombshell for so many different reasons, the interbreeding, but also the complexity in Neanderthal populations themselves. And, why shouldn't we be left with a fresh idea that Neanderthals could be beautiful, like this woman here? This is Tom Björklund's work again, or maybe even a little bit attractive, like the guy on the right. This is a Canis sculpture. So this is where I want to leave it, and just say thank you to everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rebecca. That's absolutely brilliant. Now, I'm sure you can imagine, Becky, I've got way more questions than we can fit in. So I'm just going to tell you the sort of broad areas people are interested in, and then pick a couple of things, because there's quite a few questions about Neanderthal capacities, the voice, language, intelligence, motor control. And then there's other questions about our attitudes, where they've come from, and a whole set of other questions about, the evolutionary relationship and evolutionary context. So those are the kind of three things that everyone's been really interested in. So if I can just sort of pick up perhaps on one or two, if we do have time. And several people have been asking about our relationship to Neanderthals and why and how they became extinct.
Massive question. I avoided it in the talk.
They picked that up.
Oh, yeah. Well, I do talk about it in the book, but yeah, I think, it's interesting because I've had an amazing response to the book. It's been phenomenal, and I really did not expect to have people respond so much and engage with the book, and it's been wonderful. But it is interesting that some of the comments and like even emails and things I get from people, they say, well, you didn't tell us why, you didn't answer that question. I think the reality is we don't know. Yeah. And what we can say, I think, is that there is definitely not one thing going on. And coming back to the very beginning of the talk, where I was sort of laying out the length of time they were around, all those different climates, the massive geography of the worlds that they lived in, we should not expect there to be one single cause, because how could there be over such a range of space that they were living in? So I think things that maybe were an issue or changed things for them in Western Europe are not necessarily the same as what's going on in the eastern part of the range. But also, having said that, it is interesting that so far it appears that they kind of wink out at about 40,000 years ago everywhere. So that's the contradiction. In terms of the differences between them, I did have the slide about, what's different. That probably is really significant. And, it's not a new thing to say that. The fact that we have painted caves and all this, although they are somewhat later than this period. Does this mean that we had some kind of fundamental cognitive difference? I think looking overall technologically, there's not gigantic differences. Maybe the fact that there could have been a different form of projectile technology in some of the early Homo sapiens groups that were dispersing from Africa about 50,000, 55,000. They may have had either darts or bow and arrows, and the evidence for that is that although Neanderthals could make tiny stone points, they weren't as small as these ones. So there could be something to do with hunting, but also something else going on, maybe to do with all those different sort of aspects of art and things, and that's to do with social connectivity and social networks. I don't think anyone around at that time was living at big population density, but the ability to remain connected across large landscapes could have been very important. And the other really significant difference we see is in the genetics, where Neanderthals, not all of them, but a number of them, when we look at their genetics, it shows that they came from small breeding populations. So sometimes we're talking about literal inbreeding. Sometimes it's more just they're in tiny populations, probably maybe, I don't know, a few valleys or one region. We don't see that same signal in the early Homo sapiens groups. So something is definitely different in terms of the quality of the social connections that were happening at the time.
Fantastic. Well, I think I'll need to draw it to a close there just because time's so pressing on us. But I do, just to direct people though, for some of the other questions, particularly about the sort of capacity, do look at the book. There's a lot more, as you said, Becky, there's lots more information in the book and some of the answers to many of those questions as well. So just leaves me now to say thank you so much for that talk. We've got lots of comments about what a fascinating, interesting, fabulous talk it was, and how well you coped with the IT masterclass in coping with IT meltdown with grace, someone has said. So that's
I'm so
totally
sorry
wonderful.
I couldn't answer more of the questions. I can see there's language and stuff. Yes, they did talk about something. We don't know exactly what it was.
Yeah, that's kind of it. There's a few more questions there, but that just shows you how fascinating Neanderthals are and how many questions we have about them and just what a fascinating talk it was. So thank you so much for that, Becky. That was wonderful. The recording of this event will be available on the festival YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival website after the 20th of June. You'll be contacted by email when that video is available. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Rebecca's book, copies of Kindred with signed book plates are available from our partner bookseller, Fox Lane Books. And for more information on book sales, visit the festival website. Or goes directly to Fox Lane Books.
Oh, and I am on Twitter. If people want to ask me questions on Twitter, I'm on there as
fantastic. I didn't really know if I could volunteer that, but that's a wonderful thing. Yeah. So those questions that you've got, please do direct them to Twitter, to Becky on Twitter, and she'll be happy to answer them. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for saying that. So we very much hope that you'll continue to be engaged with York Festival of Ideas. Check out the website for full details of all the events in the programme, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on these events and continue the conversations using the hashtag York Ideas. Thank you very much.